Okay, welcome back from lunch. Thank you guys all for joining us today for this afternoon session. Some quick housekeeping stuff before we move into the Ahmed's presentation. First, the job board. If you're looking for a job in Narrow AI, definitely check out the main conference website. You can see the list of jobs that are there. If you're in Montreal, don't forget to come to the social evening tonight, which is going to be in the event space above the McCarroll. So there are details on the website for that. But the most important thing right now is that I get to introduce Ahmed El Hady, who is joining us today from Germany, where he started apparently a week ago his position as a junior group leader in the cluster for the advanced study of collective behavior, which is across the University of Constance and the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior. Ahmed did his postdoctoral work at Princeton Neuroscience Institute, where he studied the neural basis of decision-making in rats and also social vocal communication in marmoset monkeys. So I think we're going to get a sense of Ahmed's breadth of interest today, for sure. He got his PhD at the Max Planck Institute for Dynamics and Self-Organization, where he worked on biophysical models of action potentials and neuronal network dynamics. And his current research interests are both experimental and theoretical studies of foraging behaviors, really across the animal kingdom, although he does have a special focus on rodents. And I'm excited to hear more about that today. Thank you, Ahmed.
Thank you, Rakesh. Yeah. Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Good. So you see my presentation? Good. So thank you first for Karim Jerby for inviting me and all the organizers for organizing this fabulous event. I wish one day we will all be in Montreal. Let me just have the. So as Beckett said, I just moved to Germany a week ago, so I'm pretty fresh and talking to you from there. So today I'm gonna walk you through some of my research plan and the work I have been doing through in the last few years and my future plans. As a trained systems neuroscientist, you would like to understand what are the brain networks that underlie behavior. And traditionally, people have done this using animal training. And the motivation to do animal training is that you have kind of control over what the animal is doing. So you say, okay, I'm gonna train the animal, for example, on an evidence accumulation task. So you think, okay, that's what the animal will be doing. You can get multiple repeatable trial. It has allowed over the last decade an relatively easy neural investigation. So one can map neural and task variables. We learned a lot through this animal training framework, but there are a lot of questions that puzzles me and puzzles, I'm sure, many others. It's that in many cases, there is a pretty long training time for animals to perform these tasks, 3 to 6 months in rats and sometimes longer in primates. In mice, sometimes it's shorter, but still, there is a pretty lengthy training time. In many cases, you have to head fix the animals, whether this is distorts the behavior of the animal or not, we don't know. You have to put the animal in water restriction to motivate them. And the big question is, are we just training the behavior or also the brain? What about state dependence? What about the body? So a lot of times when systems neuroscientists talk, they talk as if the brain itself is the one doing the behavior, either in operant chamber or on a ball head fixed. So I think there is a wave coming that try to push the boundary from what I just said, like trial-based behavior that happened over short time scale. And I'm not going to talk about neural recordings today, but from single or few brain areas only into behaviors that happen that are more naturalistic, that happen over continuously in freely moving animal over extended time scale and involve brain-wide recordings. And I'm going to focus on the issue of behavior today, of continuous behavior that are naturalistic. And having lived in New York for quite some time, I would really like to understand the behavior of the New York City celebrities that many of you might know is this rats. So you can see this rat here in Union Station at New York, carrying a piece of pizza, going down, okay, and then leaves a piece of pizza and then look behind to the pizza, and maybe the rat is thinking, should I go back to get this piece of pizza or move to another place to get a richer food? And we all do these behaviors, including other animals also that I'm fascinated with are bats. And these are data from a group here at the Max Planck Institute for Animal Behavior, tracking bats on the Mexican shore, groups of bats that are foraging for resources of insects. We do this foraging behaviors, other primates, Drosophila, C. elegans. So foraging is such a attractive behavior because every animal has to self-sustain itself through acquiring energy and search for food. It's universal, as I said. The advantage, it happens over multiple spatio-temporal scales. So I can do it in a lab environment, or I can study it in the field over very large time spatial scales. It's sensitive to the environmental structure, so it gives us an opportunity to understand how the structure of the environment affects the decision strategies of the animal. And more importantly, for me, is that it has a history in behavioral ecology of being quantitative. And recently, there have been an increased interest within the neuroscience community to tackle foraging as a foundational decision-making paradigm. So what's my approach to studying foraging? And what the approach, I call it integrative approach to foraging. So here, there are bats that there might be other animals, but usually animals forage in groups, and in order foraging for food, and in order to understand this behavior, we can understand it on several levels. The first level is the level of the ecological fitness. So what is it adapted for? Is it for mate choice? Is it for reproductive success? Is it to increase life expectancy? The second level is to understand the behavioral algorithms underlying foraging, like how does the inputs from the environment, the experience, the internal state affect what kind of algorithms the animal adopt in order to forage efficiently in an environment. The third level is how these behavioral algorithms are implemented in neural and biochemical circuitry. And relating these three levels together is what I call an integrative approach to foraging. And today I'm going to focus on the issue of behavioral algorithms and give you some toy cases that I have been playing with in order to give you some intuition on what does it mean to get into some behavioral algorithms. And the foraging behavior that I'm going to talk about today is the patch leaving behavior. It is a canonical foraging behavior which an animal enters into an environment and there are patches of food. The animal enters inside the patch, consumes some resources, and then leave, go to another patch. And the behavioral observables in this behavior are the patch residence time, the travel time, and the food intake in each patch. So in behavioral ecology, there have been a classical approach to optimal foraging theory called the marginal value theorem. So the marginal value theorem, it's a theory from the 70s that says, okay, if the animal is inside the patch, it will leave when its current patch intake is equal to the average environmental intake rate. And it's when it is plotted to the time foraging in patch by the cumulative resource intake, you get this type of curves and you get the optimal time in patch. But always the devil is hiding in the details. There are very strong assumptions underlying the marginal value theorem, which is that the animal knows the current food arrival rate, that the food is arriving continuously, that also the animal knows the environmental food availability and the statistics of the environment doesn't change. This sounds like very strict assumption. So throughout my presentation, I will use the marginal value theorem as a guiding principle and measure of for comparison. And this was the beginning of my investigations to try to get more into mechanistic models of how animals forage in an environment with a certain structure. So there are two mechanistic questions that I will hope to answer today. Is how does an animal implement a marginal value theorem or marginal value theorem like rule? Because the marginal value theorem doesn't tell us how does the animal implement it. And if we relax one of the assumptions, which is about the stability of the statistics of the environment, how do we account for it in a formal model? So today I will narrow it even down to talk about two modeling approaches that I have been taking in order to conceptualize the problem of foraging. And here really, I really want to emphasize this, that before going and doing this very large scale experiments, it was very important for me to think, how do we even conceptualize this experiments? How can we have some generative conceptual frameworks that give us some hypothesis to test? Doesn't necessarily this models will hold true. As all of you know, models by constructions are false. So the first is the heuristic accumulator model that will answer the question of how does the animal implement an MVT or an MVT-like rule. And the second is a Bayesian approach to foraging, which will account for the stochasticity in the environment. So let's get into the first question, which if the animal enters into an environment and it has these patches of food. So let's imagine I am the rat here that you see here on the slide, and I enter into a patch, I begin to consume some food. And there is some variable in my brain that is evolving over time. Whenever I take a piece of food, this variable is changing. And when it gets closer and closer to a threshold to leave this patch. So for those who have worked in system neuroscience on evidence accumulation are familiar with drift-diffusion models. And here we developed a model called Foraging drift-diffusion model, where we characterize the environment with a set of parameters. First, we have the patch that have a size, and it has food chunks inside it with certain size, and it has an initial food density that the animal is consuming, and there is a travel time between the patches. Okay, so how can we formally write what I just said? So if the animal is inside the patch, it has first to keep track of how much energy is being depleted outside in the whole environment. This is what you can call, for example, a ground average, which is the first equation here. And the second is a decision variable in the animal head that basically tells it when to leave the patch. And these two equations are quite simple. The first equation here to estimate the available energy, you have a time scale for the update of energy, you have the estimated environment energy rate of the environment, and you have
Ahmed, it sounds like your voice is cut out. I can see your mouse moving, but we've lost, or at least I've lost your speaking. Can anyone else hear Ahmed? Is it just me, or is it everyone?
No, he's frozen. Ahmed, I'm gonna remove you and add you back quickly.
Sorry about that, guys. I think it was just getting good. So I don't know if you guys heard, but he's getting added back now. Hey, Ahmed,
yes,
welcome back.
I am back from the black hole. It's fine. I will continue. Don't worry.
Thank you.
I don't know what's my internet is very good. Let's see. Okay. Can you see the presentation? Beckett, can you see it?
Almost. So it's not full screen yet, but
yeah,
see
good.
Your screen.
Okay.
Perfect.
Good. So thank you. Sorry for the disruption, but you know this is what you have to deal with these days. So I was at the point where you say, okay, we have these two equations that in this foraging drift diffusion model, one that estimates the available energy in the environment, and the second basically is the evolution of the decision variable in, let's say, in the head of the animal. It has an important parameter I was just saying. It has a drift rate. It has a drift rate, and it has the current growth rate of food intake, and it has a noise term because this is a noisy process. So if we more tangibly, if we numerically simulate these two equations, we get a picture familiar for those who worked with drift diffusion models, is that the decision variable of the animal, this probability, posterior probability of evolve over time, whenever it gets this blue thing here, a chunk of food, it basically gets a kick closer to the threshold, till it cross the threshold to leave the patch. So let's play around with the model and see the dependencies of the parameters. So I want you to trust me here that the derivations, I can talk about it offline, is that we have computed a form for the threshold, for the decision threshold, that depends on the patch size, on the drift rate, on the initial density of food in patch, on the average energy in the environment. And if we're able to, if we vary the threshold, the decision threshold, along with the drift rate, we are able to get different decision strategies. What do I mean here? So the decision strategy means if the animal inside the patch, is the animal counting the food? Is the animal estimating the density of the food? And by varying the threshold and the drift rate, we are able to get this variety of decision strategies. And if the
I'm so sorry to interrupt you again.
Yes.
Would you mind just hiding the banner at the bottom that says you're sharing your
sure.
screen?
Sure. Yes.
Sorry. Thank you.
No worries. Good. So we have two main classes of strategies, the decremental strategies and the increment-decrement strategies. And let me go deeper into them. So this increment-decrement strategy means that finding food makes the agent more likely to stay in the patch. If I find some food, I stay more in the patch. And this happens if I have a positive threshold and positive drift. Okay. The other classes of strategies called decremental strategies is finding food makes the agent more likely to leave the patch. And this we call the robust counting strategy. This sounds weird, but let's see when is these strategies are employed. So for first, this increment-decrement strategy that the animal, when they find a food, stays more in the patch is optimal when the amount of food per patch is unknown. So if the animal, let's imagine if you don't know the amount of food per patch, whenever you find the food, you are more likely to stay in the patch. And we can simulate this strategy, and we get that the patch residence time increase with the patch food density. But what if the amount of food per patch is known? So if the amount of food per patch is known, in the case of discrete reward, so chunks of food, okay, I know that there are 5 chunks, for example, so I take one. The more I take from the patch, the more I'm likely to leave. So here, I presented some assumed decision heuristics, and also assuming that this happens through an accumulation process and decision threshold, we were able to get a variety of strategies depending on the threshold and drift rate. Okay, so this seemed like a toy model that intuitively encapsulate some strategies that an agent or an animal might be employing in a foraging environment. But the question is, can we derive foraging decision strategies normatively? And here we take a turn into a Bayesian approach to patch foraging. And a Bayesian approach, as I guess many of you know, is meaning that I accumulate, and in the context of patch foraging, I accumulate statistical evidence about patch or environmental quality. There have been some Bayesian modeling in behavioral ecology, but the drawbacks that I have seen is that they were quite restricted. They were not extended to learning the environmental statistics, and they were hard to relate to motion data and body posture and neural dynamics, which is the long-term aim for me. So let's zoom out and understand what does it mean what kind of statistical inference problems is the animal facing when it enters into an environment full of resources? So an animal enters an environment, it has first to choose a habitat. So there is something called the habitat choice problem. A habitat choice problem means it's a big area that have a lot of resources. And this can be approximated by a non-depleting patch. But when I enter this habitat, I have resources in patches and I need to exploit these patches. And this is called the patch exploitation. So what is the recipe underlying this statistical inference procedure? Is that the animal enters with some prior belief over the reward rate of the patch. We call it sometimes yield rate. You will see it with the name yield rate. You enter into the patch that have some initial density. The animal encounters the food and the more it encounters the food, the more it updates its belief about the underlying yield rate of the patch. And we can write this in the form of Bayes rule. And where we have this term, KT is the number of food encounters at time T, and the P node lambda is the prior distribution of yield rates, and rho is the impact of each chunk of food on the yield rate. And if we simulate this, we get that the maximum likelihood estimation of the yield rate of the patch approaches the true yield rate of the patch. So let's enter into both problems, the habitat selection and the patch exploitation problem. So in the habitat selection, the animal, okay, you enter into a big environment and there are 3 habitats, one very rich, less rich, much, much less rich. So let's try to think, what would the animal do? The animal have to search between this habitat and then remain ultimately into the habitat that they have the highest resources. So the strategy here, we would guess that it involves minimizing the time to find the high quality patch. And the more obvious this high quality resources in the environment, it will strongly affect the behavior of the animal. Okay, does this hold in our model? So for the sake of time limitation today, I will only handle the cases where we have a binary environment. We have treated ternary environment, quaternary, up to n environments. So if I have to choose between 2 environments, one have a high reward rate and one have a low reward rate, and there is some, this is how prevalent this high habitat and low habitat is. So you can write down the belief of the animal using this stochastic differential equation that have 2 terms, one that account for the food encounter and one for the lack of food. And if this is positive, the belief suggests high patch. If this is negative, the belief suggested a low patch. So let's see how graphically this looks like, the evolution of the belief over time. So if I begin in the low yield rate habitat, I go to the, in the high, I go to the low, I go to the high, to the low, and ultimately I will leave totally the low and stay in the high. So the best strategy here is to arrive and remain in the high patch as soon as possible. And what I just said is what can be said as a sequence of stay-go decisions. And you leave at a threshold theta. So can we compute this time to arrive and remain in the high yielding patch? We are able to precisely find an expression that optimizes for time minimization problem. And it has 2 terms. One, that the first one here is account for how many visits do you need to do for the high yielding patch to recognize it's a high yielding patch. And the second one is, if you begin in the low yielding patch, how long it will take you in order to ultimately leave. And using first passage time statistics, we can compute all these parameters precisely. So this is quite neat. So let's look at the parameter dependencies of the model. And we said that the main strategy in the habitat choice problem is to minimize the arrival time. So this arrival time depends on, for example, if we keep the low yield rate constant and we increase the high yield rate, we find that the arrival time decrease, and we can get the exact relationship depending on the thresholds. If we change the discriminability, which is the ratio of the high yielding rate to the low yielding rate, keep it constant in this case, and change the percentage or how obvious the high yielding habitat in the environment, we again make the animal arrive faster to the high yielding habitat. The most interesting thing for me in this model is that we are able to compute an optimal threshold, which is not observable from the experiment, an optimal departure threshold that decreases with discriminability, which is the ratio of the high habitat to the low habitat. So let me visit again the habitat selection problem. Is that if I have three habitats, one that is very rich, less rich, and much less rich, the animal will keep searching and minimize the time to find and remain in the very high yielding environment habitat. And it does this by doing a log likelihood ratios between the high yielding resource habitat to the low yielding habitat till it reaches threshold and leave. And this is a strong deviations of the typical assumptions of the marginal value theorems that deal with reward rates all the time. So what's next? Next is the depleting environment, which is the patch exploitation problem. So if I have a depleting patch, three of them, one that is rich, again, less rich, and much less rich, that are depleting over time. So let's think what the animal will do. The animal will keep depleting a bit here, a bit there, and then a bit there, and then will tend to stay longer in the high yielding patch. So given no uncertainty over the yield rate of the patch, if the animal knows the yield rate of the patch, the forager will obey the marginal value theorem because this will satisfy all the assumptions of the marginal value theorem. But if there are uncertainties, there will be deviations. So let's see what kind of deviations do we get. So just here to be brief is that what we are optimizing here is a long-term reward rate. That's very different than in the case of the habitat selection problem where we minimize the time to find the high yielding resource. What we are doing here is the animal is optimizing a long-term reward rate to find the highly rewarding patch. So what are the two scenarios? The two scenarios that we get, as I said, that if there is no uncertainty in the estimations of the yield rate of the patch that the animal is arriving to, the leaving decisions will be based solely on depletion and will satisfy the marginal value theorem. And the second regime is if the animal doesn't know the type of patch on arrival, type of patch here characterized by its yield rate. And in the model, we can basically recapitulate this. So if we don't have any uncertainty, the optimal long-term reward rate will be satisfied when if the animal is in the high patch, it will leave when its own reward rate is equal to the optimal environmental reward rate. We can do this across a plethora of parameters. So what happens if we have an uncertainty in the environment, which what we call an uncertainty-driven regime? What will happen is the agent or the animal will tend to stay in low patches much longer than predicted by the marginal value theorem, which we call it under-harvesting, and will leave the high patches too soon, which this is under-harvesting too soon, and longer in the low patches is the over-harvesting. And this effect depends on the amount of food count per patches. So the less food there are in the patch, the more prevalent is deviations from the marginal values here. So let me recapitulate the results here from the depleting environments is that if we have three depleting patches that have first high, less high, much less higher reward rates, the animal will be depleting them and will tend to stay longer in the patches that have the highest reward rate. And it does this by computing a maximum likelihood estimation over the arrival rate, which is equivalent to the yield rate. So just to give you some conclusions is within this modeling framework, we have developed a highly flexible framework for modeling normative evidence accumulation in patch leaving decisions. And it's flexible because we can account for first the habitat selection problems that I mentioned and the patch exploitation problem. We can also account for how does the uncertainty shapes the strategies in depleting environment. So this over-harvesting, under-harvesting effects that are observed in lab experiments and also in field data. Something I haven't delved so much into also for the sake of time is we also have a learning model to see exactly how, what would be a recipe by which the animal will learn the reward structure of the environment. And we found that the learning, the food reward or arrival rates is usually quicker in depleting environments. So how can we make this modeling framework even more flexible? By making it more naturalistic. So animals usually forage in groups. So how can we extend this evidence accumulation models into groups? We can add a social information transfer term into the model by which, in this case, for example, two agents will communicate. They can communicate by something called diffusive coupling, meaning they share information between each other continuously while they are estimating the reward rate of the patch. Another thing might be a pulsatile coupling, which is if one agent leaves, the other leaves immediately. So they just share with each other the last bit of information when they cross the threshold to leave the patch. What else we can incorporate in the models? You can have heterogeneity in the way the individuals act. So you can have hierarchy within the social groups. So you can have dominant and subordinate agents that have different patch exploitation dynamics. Also, in despotic or egalitarian structures, the type of information sharing will be different. I'm hoping next time I speak at your conference, I can share more of these models. But what I can say is, okay, you talked to us about models throughout this whole talk, and the whole endeavor was to try to go beyond this controlled lab experiments in order to have much more sophisticated understanding of animal behavior. But one idea, okay, let me get some field data, but still field data sometimes are short, are highly variable, are very hard to model, while we are definitely working with some of it. So the reason I moved to Constant to build my own group is to use these imaging hangars that have been just built at the building where I'm in, at the University of Constance, which is a very large indoor facility, 15 meter by 15 meter by 15 meter, where I will be doing large-scale naturalistic indoor experiments, like try to recreate, in my case, for rodents, their naturalistic environments, but still under control and thinking in mind with the type of models that I have developed. So how the future looks like? The future looks like, for me, is to be able to have this patch foraging behavior happening while I employ all the quantitative behavioral modeling machineries that I presented some of it today, and doing a very high resolution video tracking, which we can do in this very large facility to get a lot of information about navigation strategies and posture, while the animal is being imaged, in this case using functional ultrasound imaging, which is a technique that I have used in my postdoc, but I didn't really present the data today. Because this, for me, will give us some, an example of behaviors that can be done spontaneously by the animal, doesn't need to be trained on, and in a very large scale environment. So the name of the conference is artificial intelligence neuroscience. So I thought, okay, what can I say about artificial intelligence? So one thing I always think about is what do we lack in terms of understanding the brain? It's very basic questions that personally haunt me is, can we understand the brain without an environment in which it is embedded? And from the work of the many groups, even in Constance here, specifically the group of Ian Cousin, is that there is a difference usually between single brain versus collective brain computations. What are the evolutionary constraints and ecological constraints underlying many of these behavioral algorithms? Remain an open question. Brain seems to be very energy efficient. So how this energetic optimizations are happening? So can we call off some area of ecological artificial intelligence? I wanted to put this just as a tease, and you can continue over email or Twitter. At the end, I would like to acknowledge many of my mentors and collaborators around the world, specifically at Princeton University, Carlos Brody and Asif Ghazenfar, and at CU Boulder, Zach Kilpatrick and Sibek Sabidari, and at University of Oxford, Alice Kasalnik, at Janelia Farm Research Campus, Emily Jean Dennis, at the MPI of Biological Cybernetics, Peter Dayan, and where I am currently at the MPI for Animal Behavior in University of Constance, Ian Cousin and Jacob Davidson that I have been collaborating with for the last 5 years, and all the funding agencies. And thank you for this opportunity, and sorry for the technical glitches that happened.
Considering today, Ahmed, I don't think anyone is blaming you for technical glitches. So that was very cool. I think we probably have time for about 2 questions, and it looks like there are 2 questions in the comment box. So the first one is from me. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what sort of ecological, or I know you got to the social stuff at the end, and I'm excited to see where you're going with that. But what kind of environmental factors might influence whether reward should increment or decrement the probability of staying in a patch?
Yeah, so the existence of a predator is the most salient thing. This definitely controls this very strong. For rats, for example, even for rats, if you have what?
I can hear you.
For rats, if you have very open space, they will think there is a predator. Even that's why they don't even go in the middle of open spaces. So that's why we are taking care in the design of the environment I'm building now. It's pretty dense and where they feel safe. So it's more in ecologically, it's predators. We are also working with data from the group of Mac Crawford with capuchin monkeys in Panama. And basically, it's not with the predators. It's more about the group dynamics. Sometimes some main person from the group leaves, people will stay more because they will feel afraid. So it also has to do with this, in this case, the social dynamics.
Cool. I think I was actually asking more about whether reward itself would increment or decrement the probability of staying in a patch. So I'm thinking that, like, we have this sense of, certainly over in the AI side, that like maximizing reward means doing things that were rewarding in the past. But the idea that reward would decrement the probability of repeating a behavior, I think, is something I'd love to hear you talk more about.
Yeah. So in the case where I mentioned is that if the animal knows exactly what the environment is and where you have discrete rewards. So we always deal with continuous rewards. So if the animal have discrete rewards and approximately can even see them, so you can just take 1, okay, 2, 3, and then leave. So it's basically you are decremental.
I see. So you're really thinking it's just that simple, that once you eat everything, it's gone.
Yes. Yeah. It's
okay. So the other question that is top voted that I think is related to that idea. Oh, I see. So, well, there are multiple things that have been voted up. So Guillaume asked, can this belief-based dynamics be adapted to non-stationary environments? Here, the uncertainty related to the environmental sampling might play a different role, considering non-stationary environments.
Yes, and this is in the learning models that I haven't presented. So yeah, we can basically, if in a non-stationary environment, you can do some sampling first, and over time, you learn the structure of the environment, and yeah, it's definitely possible.
I keep muting and unmuting myself because I don't want to make noise while you're answering the questions. But it looks like we have a bit more time. So Max asked, have you thought about models tracking higher belief moments like uncertainty, not just point estimates? And he's referencing Kalman filtering there.
For now, no. We wanted to have something very close to the ecology of the animal, but for now, I have to consider.
Okay, then it looks like we have one last question here from Paul Chizek, who's asking, do you think there are specific brain circuits dedicated to the kinds of foraging problems that you define? So like habitat selection might be different than patch foraging might be different from maybe matching law or something where you see a very different pattern of behavior.
Yeah, so, and this is why I mentioned the functional ultrasound imaging, because it will allow us to really scan many brain areas simultaneously, because a lot of this problem haven't been really studied. And some preliminary data that I have is specifically when it comes to, I would say, habitat selection, but on a smaller scale. It's more like hypothalamic some hypothalamic circuits are involved because food rewards, but then also hypothalamic, I would say ACC circuit, but I'm still analyzing this data. So that's why I'm using the functional ultrasound approach, because you can basically get so many areas simultaneously. But I would guess that there are circuits that are changing when you go into the patch exploitation task, because the environment will be more changing. So maybe you will get different activation in ACC, you'll get more cortical involvement. Maybe in the habitat choice, you will have less cortical involvement and more subcortical involvement. And but people should look subcortical for decision making.
Awesome. Thanks, Ahmed. And I'm really excited to see what's going to happen with this big field. It seems like such a
it's
able to access such a different kind of decision.
Yes.
Yeah, it's very good.
Great. Take care. Bye-bye.
So let's thank Ahmed again. I can clap, but everyone else has to is clapping. And I'll be back in a second with Yalda Mozinzada. So thank you guys again. Thank you, Ahmed, for an interesting talk. Really enjoyed it. Really looking forward to seeing what you do.